In this timely fireside chat, experts reveal how the backlash goes beyond politics to threaten hard-won civil rights gains. Let's just give a round of applause.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're waiting for the big man to get here. Waiting for the big man to get here so we can start this.
There he is.
There he is. No worries. So, DeMarc and Charles, SCLC, they let me work with them on some stuff, so I'm lucky to spend some time with them, get their ideas. But through all this DEI stuff, especially since the election, conversation came up. We're responding. I mean, DEI is clearly on the downslope. What are we going to do differently? What can be done differently? And DeMarc and Charles came with this unique idea, which is what we're going to talk about. I mean, so I think we'll let DeMarc kind of open it up, and then we can move over to Charles, and we'll go back and forth.
Okay, sure.
And I'm sorry, DeMarc's the president and CEO of SCLC. Charles Brooks is the general counsel. Sorry, in case I'm
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think, like you said, we can jump straight into it. I think the conversations, the key point kind of framed into, how do you lead into these moments, right? And so it's a couple of things. One of the things I know that I think is important for context and framing is that we knew that there was going to be a war on this word of DEI and trying to grapple with the fact that when certain groups of people latch onto a word, they don't let it go. And when they won't let it go, holding onto the language inherently can in many ways stifle some of our partners who want to stay engaged with us, but they can't figure out in their own world, how can I continue to do this if there's a war on this phrasing of words? And so you always try to grapple and find that line between staying in certain fights, but at the same time, making sure that you both think about and help provide a framework for your allies to continue the work, right, and to continue the resource. And so that's kind of how the conversation started. And when you hear us talk about our kind of QMCs, it was just a natural conversation. And inside the conversation, it was, Briggs, I think it was probably easy for you to jump in because I'll keep talking. But I do think it came up that one thing that is universally true is that, Black folk have never asked for quotas. We've never asked for almost anything except for to be judged on our qualifications and our merits. And that's where kind of the conversation about why not lean into that, because if the face value conversation is, we want to make sure that on the face value conversation that it's not lost to anybody that inside of our community, we 100% believe we can compete on our qualifications.
Right. So let me jump into, because I'm coming into it from the legal side, which I was asked about. The issue of DEI is who is included, and constitutionally, what's your protection? Because that's what the attack is going to be. It's going to be about what's your constitutional issue. So just quick history lesson. You already had a wave of some of what I consider some of the best civil rights litigation. That's not 1960s, that's 1880s. The best stuff came right before Reconstruction, because that's the most growth of our wealth. African Americans own the largest percentage of Americans' wealth before 1890. Those are facts. So the question is, what are we really talking about? Being able to get a piece of the pie. And so you go back to, what is QMC about? Qualified, meritorious candidates, because that's what the issue is about. The issue is about who's qualified to have the contract, who's qualified to have the job, and what you see is DEI is bad, let's bring in this person, and then you look at their qualifications and they're garbage, right? That's what you've seen a ton of. So the language we're going for.
You say the garbage, who are we talking about?
Oh, there's a bunch of different people. Have you seen getting these appointments?
Okay, I was sure make sure we're talking about make sure we were talking about Black people being unqualified. Or you,
no. And let's even go back
from
to
the other side.
Something.
Okay.
And let's even go
on the
back
other side where they're talking about the qualifications mean so much,
Gotcha.
and then say all you have to do is say juxtapose Austin and Hexmouth, right? And their resumes just don't stack up, and so there's no. There's no reasonable conversation, but of course we're not, and that's, just jumping in, but we understand we're not in reasonable conversations. And so you're still trying to find ways to lean into the kind of almost this game that they're playing, But I think that's what we're talking about with the
Exactly. And so the question becomes, how did the vestige of slavery affect those candidates? And a lot of those candidates, and we're talking about business owners, when I'm going back to the 1800s, I'm just going to stick there just for a second. They had the skill sets, right? And those who had the skill sets about milling, handling horses, whatever those things were, they got wealthy. And that's why when yesterday, I loved that list of major race riots in America. Almost all of those were African Americans either being burned to the ground, and it missed the modern one, which includes the MOVE bombing, which is the second time on domestic soil there was a use of an incendiary device to burn a black neighborhood to the ground. The first being Tulsa, the second being Philadelphia, and that's not 1880, that's 1980s, okay? So what does the vestige of slavery affect the qualified meritorious candidate? Can they do the job? That's the question. Now, let's go to something that I personally, and we can discuss this because people find this controversial. The one thing I found useful about this critical period, about all of this terminations and everything, is the number that came out, which is $890 billion in contracts, DOD alone. So if DEI was serving our nature, how many people do you know who lost a $100 million contract?
right.
A lot of people lost $100 million contracts.
Well,
Nobody I know.
and I think that's a good point when you're watching the DEI conversations too. Is we spent a good part of last year complaining about DEI, right? Because we already knew that it wasn't helping our communities, right? And so for those of us in the fight before, November, we were still mad at alleged DEI efforts because we already knew we weren't getting it. And so again, when you look at kind of the bigger, I hate to say bigger picture, when you look at it from a different perspective, how much if you go fight for something that wasn't working for you, and then they give it back to you because you asked. You see what I'm saying? So they're like, you know what? You're right, you can have it back.
Do
I'm
you
gonna go
want it?
back to 5% of contracts or less.
Right.
Right? And they're like, and you begged me for that. They're like, I took it from you, you begged me for the 5%.
Yeah.
And they're gonna pat themselves on the back and go, see, you can have it back. And that's another part of that kind of, is we were all talking, and I think that's kind of the framework of this. This was a
And the reason why I wanted-
relatively spirited conversation between the three of us, because again, and this is what you struggle with in that, when I say like the work side of this, because you're trying to figure out not just sound bites and not just something for the media, but you're really trying to come up with things that make sense, that keep the spirit and the essence of who we are. But it's just a lot, and there's no rubrics to this. It's a hard thing.
So one of the things that
Brooks,
I've been talking
can we take
to about.
questions from the floor?
Someone got a question?
Oh, we got a question?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Before you just got back down too far the road, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the list that you published and about the black cities that were burned and people were killed. I would say over 90% of those was to steal the land. It was about stealing and displacing folks from land that was really valuable, and whatever else they used was a smokescreen in order to do just that. And was that the case with the pressure bomb in Philadelphia?
Yes, it was absolutely, because that was downtown property. But more importantly, let's not exclude the lands that were flooded that wasn't on that list.
Right.
So Georgia, you had a city flooded. Lake Martin, Alabama, you had a city flooded. Just absolutely flooded it.
Well,
These are both successful cities.
I think it's important to know too, past the land, it was also specifically meant to bankrupt actual assets of owning businesses, right? Because land ownership is a big part of acquiring wealth, but so is owning businesses. And we know that the reason they were mad at all of these places is that the businesses themselves had self-contained themselves, so they were still functioning well inside of depressive environments for the majority, and they were like, we got to get rid of their businesses, because when our dollar turns over in our community, right, which is what other communities experience, they could have a hiccup. We weren't hiccuping because at that time we were probably spending, our dollars turning probably 30, 40 times in our own community. We're now spending like 7 cents.
And so one of the things about the numbers is we got to take from history. A lot of times it's focused on what happened in the South. In the early 1800s, it was like 4,000 mega black farms in Michigan. They almost all gone. They were gone probably by the times of the Civil War. Because what was happening is African Americans settled the property. As you go further west, sometimes they were part of the displacement of Native Americans. If we're going to have an honest conversation, every Buffalo Soldier wasn't a hero. A lot of them were Native American killers. Those are just facts. You use a group of people to settle land, then once the economic rise can displace, left displace, you end up with a large black population in California because you can't push you any further other than out to the ocean. So my point of it is, what does the qualified moratorium candidate have an opportunity for? There was a lot of discussions yesterday about banking. Sliding that off to the side, I'm not trying to disrespect it or change it. A lot of the people who we talked about in terms of larger contracts, in terms of dealing with Kevin, which I was trying to bring up yesterday, and I'm sorry, I should just bring it up now. It was about getting $100 million, $300 million, $400 million based upon an idea. That happens all the time. And it is excluded typically toward our communities, and then you hear about it. $300 million loan to start in photovoltaics, which is solar panels. I need $200 million to handle security, so I'm gonna start this thing called Blackwater. Those things have nothing to do with a loan. That's your federal government creating large infrastructure needs. So one of the reasons why we were up here earlier as an entity, and I'm limiting some of the conversation, I'm not gonna go into the depth about it because of where we were when we were up here for the World Bank IMF meeting, is how are foreign currencies evaluated, who holds the natural resources of the future, and guess what? Who held the natural resources of the past? Africa. Who holds the natural resources of the future? Africa. It's not hard, the numbers are listed, it's all publicly described, and I'm talking about rare earth metals. Now, that doesn't dissuade anything from oil and gas and some of the other things, and so I'll give a quick example, then I'll bounce it back. Dangote is a Nigerian who started a refinery outside of Lagos. Because he began to hold his own country's wealth, his wealth went from 13 billion to 28 billion in 7 months. That allows you to make changes. Now, does that mean that you can go tomorrow and do business in Nigeria? No, I'm not telling you that. But going back to the qualified meritorious candidate discussion, what are you qualified to do? And some qualifications people don't know that they already have. And I'll go into two things that are just kind of low-lying fruit, and then I'll bounce it back. Cybersecurity in the military. If a kid is in the military, he needs to take that class. The U.S. military has the best cybersecurity class in the world. And you got a whole lot of African Americans who coming out of the Navy, out of the Army, and they have security clearances that are up to the top, and they let them go. That's crazy. That stuff is worth a ton of money because there's certain contracts you can't qualify with without it. There are tons of people who want that security clearance. And in DC, everybody should know, but people don't know. But a lot of times it's the guy who comes out, he's been working in Afghanistan, I'm going back home to, I don't know, Iowa, Alabama, South Florida, it doesn't really matter. But he lets that thing lapse, and getting it back is a hard road to hoe. But he thought it was easy because he got it, because he was doing something, I don't know, minesweeping, whatever he was doing. So I'm just saying, that's the qualified meritorious candidate. Be aware of the qualification that allows you to step into a broader door.
So I want to ask a little bit of a definition on the qualified meritorious candidate council or candidate conversation. Like, what are we doing here? So how is that a replacement for DEI?
Right.
Well, I think it's I don't like to use the word replacement, right? That's probably not the way you want to do. But what you do want to be able to impress to corporate America is that we're still looking for you to hire the qualified candidates. And so as this debate rages over here about DEI, it's important to not let that be definitively become black, right? Because what happens, they go, well, we're arguing about DEI, we'll make that black, and then it'll just kind of sit in isolation as a debatable point, which means all the candidates that come through that pipeline will be sidelined until the conversation is resolved. Am I making sense? And so you want to give them framework to continue to say, well, as this debate rages on this side, we are still producing candidates on this side, and it's important that we make sure, not just for hiring, not just for colleges, I mean, for going back to the, as my brother's always talking about, contracting, whatever it may be, we need to make sure that as the debate rages, as an unresolved debate, that the candidates that were coming through those pipelines have a place where they can land, and that we are going to corporate interest saying that we're looking at that and not through a DEI lens. Because if you only look at it through a DEI lens, they're going to jam you up because that's what they specialize in jamming you up.
And here's the thing about case law. It has to fit within the case law. So there's two things that matters. McDonnell Douglas, which talks about what you do having to be qualified to be able to have a job. The other one that I think is kind of floating kind of in the ether around here is Richmond versus Croson, which is the affirmative action cases. So the issue becomes, were you qualified? Here's the funny thing about how Richmond versus Croson was such this bad evil that you had to get rid of it. It built Atlanta. The affirmative action programs built Atlanta, built that airport, which was the busiest airport in the United States, and I think still is.
It is.
That's who did it. And a third of those Olympic contracts for those stadiums, they were African American. Nothing's falling down. Like, there's a whole bunch of places around the world where the stadiums don't work anymore. Everything in Atlanta is functional. Every last one, period. So there was no problem with what the level of construction, engineering, architecture. We got to reconstruct the language, and the language becomes qualified, meritorious candidate.
Can I ask, so we're talking about solutions, how to push forward. So as we think about all the things we're doing about dismantling DEI and segregation and all that, at the government, how can this concept be, like I said, we're going to try to get it put into the appropriations bill that no money can be spent unless you use the qualified meritorious, like how can we put that into practice as a concept or as a legal construct?
Yeah, as a legal construct, it's really tough for the reason of we're beginning to change what it was about. In a case Keevan sent to me was the guy in Missouri talking about suing Starbucks because it was late and it must have been a bunch of black people and Latinos serving it. I think that's what he was, I think he wrote. Yeah. So part of it is that clearly shatters all the definitions of McDonnell Douglas, the old original Supreme Court rulings. So you've got to anchor yourself to something that's not emotional, that's structurally a part of what the Supreme Court has been doing, and fit into it. Let me jump to an old case really quickly. There's something that I was taught in law school, and it didn't even make sense when I was 22 years old and I heard it the first time. The slaughterhouse cases are the cases that help destroy the protections for African Americans after Reconstruction. They never made any sense. And you could have a 3-day nuanced conversation about slaughterhouse, but here's the facts. The lawyer for that case was a deeply held slavery supporter who was on the United States Supreme Court. He steps down and he comes to his boys and say, here's this construct to destroy the fact that they're owning property, they're voting, they're developing communities. So you got to think about what the legal constructs are in terms of moving forward and what those arguments are going to look like, because you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which goes back to what DeMarc is saying, that you're going to have to inculcate yourself into language that's consistent with what the courts are going to recognize. So, and I'm trying to come right to the point real quick. You want a judge to say, qualified meritorious candidate shouldn't get the job. Average person goes, what?
Right.
The qualified meritorious candidate doesn't get the job? How does that make any sense? So the vilification of DEI, from our standpoint, the question is what's to move on? Number two, when you reconstruct the language like that, you can go into what really matters and affect people and the vestige of slavery. Vestige of slavery actually can include other groups beyond African Americans who are affected, Chinese railway workers, things that happen in other parts, but it's going to be primarily an African American issue and what happened and how it affected a community. And that goes on. And that's one of the other things about that list that was up yesterday that I really like. It talked about the Zoot Suit riots, which we could talk about for days, because what was really happening was soldiers attacking Latina women. And I'm not going to get into specifics, but I think you understand what I'm talking about.
Right.
I don't know if there's any kids in the room.
They might be online.
So, you guys have been meeting with people, talking to other civil rights groups. What's the likelihood? Because it seems to me the one of the things we did talk about was the fact that if we're getting back to a anti-discrimination or civil rights act construct, right? As we're trying to enforce that. So how do we get other people to fall into this, or have you talked to anybody else and got pushback?
I wouldn't say it's pushback because it's how you present it. I do think that, again, I don't really see this as an idea that's in conflict with any other. ideas. Like my person, I really think that DEI is going to exist as a raging battle over here. And this is an idea that allows for something else to happen simultaneously. Now, if someone chooses to spend all their time in the DEI battle, go for it, right? I'm not against any fight, but it's been my experience dealing with the right. We'll just take CRT, which is really what has informed and framed it. When they looked at CRT, they took a small collegiate course that you had to sign up for, created it as a monster in the K-12 system that never even existed, and did it so well that they started running candidates at the K-12 level to stop CRT at K-12.
Which didn't exist.
Now, the other challenge when I say, and I think it's important for us is, folks, the right is so good at getting us to affirm their position by our outrage. So they'll say, hey, they're teaching our kids CRT. Because we understand the dog whistle of what they really mean, we immediately jump into the fight, right? Because we know that their intentional language is rooted in their racism and their bigotry. But what they said was CRT. We jump in the fight because of the underlying and go, we should defend that. Even though it just wasn't happening K-12. We could have just easily said, sure, right? Because it wasn't being taught anyway. But then they turned CRT into this thing, and then they used the actual CRT platform, made the whole thing black. But the actual CRT program wouldn't have been a good thing to have in front of, say my 9-year-old boys.
Right.
But they use all of that to start flushing all of our stuff out. Yeah. Am I making sense? Yeah. But it's how they connect the dots. They'll put something out that's not true. We jump into the defense thereof, but we validate all of their original points, even though all their original points were invalid.
And let me say it another way. This is an offensive position. Yeah. Typically, we're talking about defensive positions to defend something.
Yeah. Right.
This is an offensive position of language uses moving forward, which is, why do you want these women, these African-American women, to have the contract with the city dealing with bond issues? Because they're the qualified, meritorious candidate.
Can it also be used to find out who's not qualified? So we know there are a lot of people who aren't minority who are unqualified.
Right.
Can we use that standard to have them evaluate all of them?
Yes.
And absolutely, and that feeds back into the original McDonnell Douglas. Because the question was, who's the comparator? That's not our language, that's the Supreme Court of the United States. Who are you comparing it to? Because one of the early defeats were, these people didn't have degrees. This person doesn't have this qualification. And it was a way to dismiss. And as African Americans began to go, okay, we got to get those degrees. We got to get these qualifications. But
right.
then, the ball kept moving. That goal kept getting higher and higher and higher and higher. And now what happened was, it had gotten so high that unqualified cousin Bubba, he couldn't make it either.
Right.
So we got to backdoor that.
But I will say to the point though, it is also framework. Say when you look like an admissions process, it's also a framework that allows you to go and you can press the button using their language. Right. Hey, you said that you're all about qualified. Explain to me how, I don't want to say anybody. This white man here, and this is his qualifications made it.
Yeah.
What about his photo made him that way?
Yeah.
Because we already know we got a photo over here.
Yeah.
Like you guys, I did not go to law school. You guys did. When it hit through, I think Harvard Law, y'all get a call from one of my friends that went there. She's like, man, this is ridiculous. And I think Harvard's one of those examples because Harvard has produced so many folk.
Right.
But according to them, all of them shouldn't have been there.
Right, none of them should have been there.
Just by the basis of them just being black, somehow flush them out of the system. So to your point, if you start the conversation around qualification, which is why I started with context, we, pretty much every group of people that's not wealthy white men of privilege have always said the same thing. We feel like we're being overlooked. And so, but on the other side, we know they're over there. Like we know they're there. So you say, well, hey man, if you were talking about qualifications, to his point about being offensive, flip it. Explain to me how this guy is qualified and this woman was not.
And it becomes good international language. And that's another thing we're working on now. What are you qualified to do that works internationally? For instance, Are you going to help with clays? Can you do manganese? And I got 2 minutes, so I'll be real quick. One of the things that happened to me, I was taking a trip down to South Africa working for some things with the ANC. There was a young brother, he was from Atlanta. He had married a Singhalese wife. He told me in the cargo hold, he had a refrigerator box full of scars. And he was taking them to the swap meet to sell them. And he comes into Atlanta twice a month and sells them out. If you're going to move to the level of being able to do business with foreign countries, and these countries are developing really fast, and many of them have multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects, I've been told by African ministers, one in particular told me, there's no such thing as a black engineer. I was like, dude, I'm telling you, we got whole colleges full of them. And he just did not believe me, a bit more than man in the moon. So the language is not only domestically, to me, the language is international.
We're running out of time, so I want to see if there's questions. You want to have questions? Time?
Yeah, so I do diversity training from time to time, and one of the things I tell people is, you know, you're investing your money, are you putting all your money in one place? Of course not, you diversify. So they automatically understand that, you know, the diversity issue when it comes to their money and their finance. And so I also said it also parlays to what people are doing in their work environment too. You know, so just because your daddy can buy a building and that's how you got into Harvard, and just because your mama is on the city council and the governor, all this nepotism stuff, doesn't make you the best candidate. You know, so sometimes people just need to be reminded of their humanity and the privilege that they have as well.
Yeah. Well, the problem for us going with the DEI, I think, is that all the lawsuits and all the activity around it is making it, that's not even, that conversation is hard to be had. I mean, you can't even get there. That's why we're.
But sometimes
and I would.
Charles' point about, you know, this thing about, you know, like words and semantics and things like that, we may not be able to reach, you know, the orange guy right now, but people who are in his sphere, who may actually be like, oh my goodness, well maybe it is me, maybe I'm part of the problem. So sometimes it's the grassroots way too to help effectuate change. That's
fair, but that's a fair point. It's a good point. I do want to say though, because you brought up the lawsuits, I do think one of the hardest challenges is it's going to take all of us a second to really understand, or seemingly it's going to take us a long time to understand how cataclysmically bad the Supreme Court ruling was at all. We seem to be really, I wouldn't say slow, it was just such a bad case, but because they won the case, right? It's kind of like the lawyers that still are going around finding buildings that are not ADA compliant, because the whole country wasn't. So when they made this case, it was like, this is great. It's still lawyers going, this is what, 30, 40 years later. But my point is, the whole country set itself up for Supreme Court rulings. The guy was losing in court for,
Talking about
Bloom, for decades. Yeah, I will say this about Bloom, because I got the mic. I want to be clear, just kind of piggybacking on anybody who heard me talk yesterday about resources. Bloom, who led the charge against the affirmative action and the court cases.
and the voting rights too.
And the voting rights stuff. This guy had this dream for decades, and his community kept funding him over and over again. He was losing so bad. I mean, he was losing everywhere. He was losing at the local courts. He was losing the federal courts. I mean, he was losing. And every year he would take himself back to the same group of people and say, hey, I know I lost last year, but hear me out. I really think we can get rid of it. And when I say about that, about the resource conversation, it's important, and I'm kind of tying in from yesterday, but we have this belief in the immediacy, but we're fighting people who are taking these very long-term positions, and they're funding themselves over very long-term positions, right? But they did win the case. And so now, when we want to go and say, well, hey, where are your minority set-asides? Because that's just what our inclination to say it, it's going to get back to, they're like, oh, we don't have those. And then we're going to get back outraged again. But the law of the land says that you can't do that. Or at least that is the way they've been saying the interpretation of it is recently. And I guess until we can get it back to court, that's why they're here, not me. But my point, I do think it's important for us to just kind of own I hate to say own the defeat, but if it happened at the Supreme Court level the same way, if the Supreme Court says, hey man, this is the way it is, it's the way it is. And we've got to figure out a ways to maneuver around that. Otherwise, you're just going to keep waking up and being mad at the same thing, which is we lost the case. And it's horrible that we lost the case. It's frustrating that it's infuriating that we lost the case. And all those are great emotions, but none of those emotions are going to change the fact we lost this case until we can get it re-adjudicated.
Yeah, it's never, when you talk about Bloom, the thing that's the most amazing to me is they hate us so much more than we love ourselves. They'll spend all of their money. I mean, even the girls, you're from Atlanta, what's that, the Fearless Fund?
Yeah.
Bloom did he did the lawsuit against the Fearless Fund, $250,000, $25,000 scholarships. He spent about, what, $1 million on that case?
Mm-hmm.
About $1 million to stop black women from getting $25,000 grants. I mean, you know how much.
From black women giving black women money, their
black-
own money.
black women
He
give-
wanted black women to stop giving black women money,
Yeah.
their own money.
That, you know how deeply committed you are to that effort? I mean,
Also talk about suing Obama's fund as well.
yeah, they sued Obama's, yeah, they sued the Obama's fund.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Along those lines, I'm a communications professional, and one of the things that has been making me absolutely crazy for the last 15 years, so I'm very, like, I watch politics a lot and everything, is the fact that, to your point, both of your points about the long game that the other side has done, and the fact that it's propaganda, and a lot of the issues around CRT, around BI, et cetera, the war of the words.
Right.
Propaganda, and the fact that I find like a number of the center left to far left groups, there's not as much energy put behind that. There's almost like this distaste for propaganda because it's viewed as, you know, an ethical, which, yeah, technically it is to a point, but when you're dealing with a war of words, you're already tied with one arm behind your back.
Yeah.
By the time, you know, to your point, you know, CRT was something that was at a collegiate level. It wasn't even at all facing grade schools or anything like that, but they were able to demonize it, where they were able to create a slew of candidates, including the governor of Virginia, who won because of CRT.
And to
Yes.
your point, one of the real quick decisions, just talking about the left or the right, I want us to understand that at times, unaligned libertarian positions will align to what we just spoke about.
That is true.
And knowing the difference between a libertarian and a Republican is huge.
That is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
The other
Yeah,
side,
all the time.
I want to say this about
Wait,
the other
then
side,
we
and
got to go ahead.
I do not mean to be a broken record, but a lot of times it's also propaganda requires money, and I cannot overstate this. We don't like to give money. We just don't. And I'm
Can you tell me the story?
so what?
Tell the story about Selma. I just Selma, about the speech of Selma.
Oh, I told him yesterday.
Oh, you told me? I
Yeah.
didn't hear that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yes, please donate. Please donate. But when I say that, it's we are just super reluctant. We like to be outraged. We love to tweet, right? We love things that do not cost us money, right? And those things are good. But to your point, if you're in it, you're facing people who have real money. And when I say you're facing real money, if you say, hey, I want to get this passed in a bill, it doesn't matter what state I go to, I got to talk to this, I got to figure out what committee handles that. There's a committee. Cool. But to get to that committee, there's like 10 people with 10 staff members. That's a whole nother thing, right? By and large, we don't have lobbyists. If any of us got lobbyist friends, they make a bunch of money. Why do your lobbyist friends make a bunch of money? Because they're the people who spend their money getting in front of the people so they can get in front of the people. Am I making sense? And that's on the interpersonal side. They do the same. These are the same folks who created like 4 news channels out the blue. You know what I'm saying? I mean, Fox is now almost mainstream, which is crazy, right? I mean, they have.
in public.
Oh, that's crazy. I mean, but my point is, when you talk about propaganda, and which goes to, I mean, we can have another conversation too, and I know there's just so many points. You know, when you talk about the digital space, right, where we all are, particularly black folks, we're highly susceptible to social media. And we have this erroneous belief that these algorithms that are in front of us are some type of organic thing. No, someone is paying that, well, 2 things. They're owned by people who do not like us, problem. But then there's another side where people are paying to drop things into your feed to make you believe things that are true that are not. But going back to your propaganda point, but all those things require actual money. Not just in terms of I got to buy the media ad, I got to create the graphics, I got to do the what do you call it, little focus groups. I mean, these are well thought out. I'm really big on that. We are fighting well organized people. Just because they are not our friends, there's nothing about them inherently that says they're not smart. Like some of these people are really smart. These are incredibly formidable foes, which is why they keep on the surface. Like, how does the right even win? Anyway, My point is they're winning because they're very well thought, they're very well seated, they're very well organized. And at some point, if you hear me talking, keep saying it, if you don't give money, you don't get money.
Freedom ain't free, that's for sure.
Keegan talks about that all the time, literally, don't you?
Well,
So
you,
that's why we're here, so what you're saying is relevant.
go ahead, yes, ma'am.
Okay, well, speaking of, money on a smaller scale.
You got a check? No, I'm just joking.
They add up.
I'm joking with you, sister, I'm joking.
Right.
So, and I tell people, and some people, they don't like to hear it, but, when there was segregation for 100 years, and black people could not shop in white establishments. So black businesses were able to flourish because of that. And then, of course, they didn't like to see that. So, of course, then they started attacking the businesses, like you were saying, in a systematic way, destroying their neighborhoods and all of that kind of stuff. So then, just a few years ago, they decided to establish the hate crime law, right? So the hate crime law, and it reduced the number of attacks on black businesses and other businesses. They included more than just black. And now, what's happening right now is they're attacking South African, who's white, business, Tesla all over, but he doesn't qualify as a hate crime because he's not black. So, of course, the guy decided, let's make it domestic terrorism over this one company, right? But what I'm trying to say, all this was just because the buildup is, I know that there's a buy black type of movement. There are, and I live here in DC where there's pride flags. People have no problem. Nobody's afraid to shop in the pride flag establishments. There's lots of Latino stores. The Latinos will buy in the Latino stores. But there's still fear amongst the black entrepreneurs and businesses to display that they're black. Right? And because they're afraid of retaliation. So how can we get around that?
Well,
I think it's more retaliation. They afraid that they're gonna lose money because some black people don't want to buy from black people.
Yeah, that's part of the problem.
And white people don't want to buy from
Right.
black people.
And I think-
I'm gonna get
we
hate
way out.
crime if I don't stop.
Yeah, I
right
think we're
now.
getting each other.
we way out of time.
Thank you guys both.
Yes.
Thank you.